Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's now 4 o'clock here in London in the UK, so time for us to start this, our final Transformative Teachers webinar for 2023. What a year, can't believe it's almost over. I see lots of people are using the chat box already. If I could just ask everyone to confirm they can hear me by typing something in the chat box, that would be great. And thank you, as always, for letting us know where you're from. It looks like we've got a really nice, wide variety of colleagues coming from Myanmar, India, Burkina Faso, Oman. So really nice. And I know there are some people from the UK here as well. So as always, a very international collegial membership here today, which is fantastic. Just before we get started and I hand over to today's presenter, as always, I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar will last about 1 hour, probably about 45 minutes, 50 minutes will be of the presentation, and there'll be some time at the end for questions. Now, don't worry if you have to leave. I know some of you are in different time zones or may have classes to go off to. This is being recorded. So once this is over, if you have to leave, it will be recorded and it will be uploaded later on onto the Transformative Teachers website, which I will continually be putting into the chat box, so you won't be able to lose it. And you'll also get a reminder email later when this goes up. Now, at the moment, you should be able to see me and hopefully the slides on screen. You do not have access to video or microphones, but we do want you to interact with us as always. So please, as you're already doing, do use the chat box to put in any questions or comments or anything you think will be useful for anyone here today. You may also want to use the Q&A button. That means when you've left a question, we'll be able to see it. As you'll see, the chat box moves quite quickly. So if you have a question for Suzannah, please put them in there and we will try and get through as many of those as possible, either during her talk or at the end of it. So without further ado then, I'm going to hand over to Suzannah. For those of you who don't know, Suzannah Redmond is an experienced ESOL lecturer, teacher trainer, examiner and item writer. She graduated with a degree in Hispanic Studies from the University of Manchester and was inspired to gain a qualification that would allow her to travel the world and teach. So she completed her Trinity Cert TESOL and later the DIP TESOL. She's a co-founder of Train to Teach, and so that means she now delivers the Level 5 Trinity Cert TESOL course and runs volunteer training programs in Manchester here in the UK. She's delivered government-funded projects such as Talk English and the English for Integration Fund, and she currently organises ESOL provision for local councils in the northwest of England. Thank you for joining us, Suzannah.
Hi there, good evening, good afternoon.
Great for you to be here.
Thank you, Simon. Can I share my screen?
Certainly can. It's all over to you now.
Fantastic, okay. So just checking you can all see my screen there. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much everyone for signing up and coming along this afternoon or evening or morning, whatever the time may be. And thanks, Simon, for your introduction. So as Simon said, my name is Suzannah and I'm the co-founder of Train to TEFL. So we are a validated Trinity Cert TESOL course provider. And also we run English classes in the Northwest with local councils and also working with local community groups. So before we set up Train to TEFL, both my partner and I have worked in lots of different ESOL and EFL positions for many, many years. So we're drawing on all our experience really to bring you this presentation today. Okay, so as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned actually, yeah, we are based in Manchester in the northwest of England. But even though we are talking about increasing strategies for ESOL accessibility, and I'll be making lots of references to the work that we've completed in Manchester. But hopefully you'll come away today with lots of ideas for how you can also maybe implement some of the strategies that we've used, and things that we do to try and increase ESOL provision for learners. Okay, so let's begin then. I think it's important to start just with clarifying the terms that we'll be using. I know these will all be familiar to you, but we'll be talking about ESOL, or certainly the situation or the environment that I'm working in, and my teachers at Train to Tough are working in, is in an ESOL environment. So that's for providing English classes for learners who are living in the UK and are using English every day as part of their daily life. And also this applies to any other learner or someone that's living in an English-speaking country. And that's opposed to EFL, which is for people who are learning English, perhaps in a country where English isn't the first language, but are also using it for a variety of different reasons. So if I talk about ESOL, just because I'm used to sort of speaking about ESOL because that's the context that I'm working in, but the strategies that we'll be talking about will apply to both EFL and ESOL contexts.
And I think, as we said when we had our chat earlier last week, that there's kind of a Venn diagram there. So lots of these things do come together. And even if we're in an EFL setting, some of our students might move into an ESOL setting. So it's actually a lot of the things, I'm excited to hear more of them, but a lot of the things will help us whichever our teaching context.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm sure actually probably it'd be quite interesting to know just through the chat where people are working actually. Would they say that they are working in ESOL or in EFL? I don't know if anyone would like to just let us know in the chat. Okay, ESOL, EFL, yeah. Ooh. Fantastic. Yeah, gosh, it does move quickly, doesn't it, the chat? Fantastic. Okay. So let's have a little bit of context then as well about today's webinar. So how many people in the world actually speak English and use English? Well, there are 8 billion people or more now. Actually, the number rises all the time of people in the world. Estimated 400 million native speakers of English. We also have, as you can see, 1.75 billion people who speak English to a useful degree. So this is a figure that's taken from a British Council report called the English Effect, which was written in 2013. So you can imagine now these numbers have increased as well. So over 750 million EFL learners, so people learning English in countries where English isn't spoken as a first language, and 375 million ESOL learners. So why are people learning English? Why is English important? And then obviously, why is ESOL accessibility so important? Well, here are just some of the main reasons why English has become such a dominant language. We all know that English is used all over in the internet. For example, I think half the web pages are said to be written in English. Information, papers, academic papers, entertainment, so much is now in English. And obviously with the internet, people can access a lot of English language materials and so on. So what are the benefits then? Why do people want to learn English? So we can see there are lots of benefits, not just for ESOL learners, but what are the benefits of learning English for EFL or ESOL learners, whichever their situation might be? So access to information, we've got lots of job opportunities, opportunities to interact internationally, to move perhaps to different places, to travel, to learn about different cultures, to build different communities. There's lots of advantages for learners to be able to speak English, and any language actually, but obviously English is a dominant language that we're talking about. So conversely then, if there are lots of advantages, what can be the disadvantages of not being able to speak English or to speak English well? So as we've mentioned, there are lots of positive and beneficial aspects, but if you are unable to speak English, particularly if you're living in an ESOL context, this means that then you're less likely to be able to access information, you're more likely to be in a lower paid job if you're living in the UK, if your English level is low, and you're more likely also to be unemployed because you have less ability to communicate in English. You're probably more likely to have poorer health because you can't access information, and also to be increasingly more socially isolated, actually, without being able to speak English very well.
So quite serious things going on here in an ESOL context, I
Mm.
suppose. And then in the EFL world, maybe we could say, well, as English is a global language, it's kind of an added bonus to have English in some of these situations. So it could affect some people in EFL situations as well, where a promotion might be linked to having English as an additional language, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked in France and my partner as well for some time, and we had lots of friends there who worked in companies where English was the spoken language. So obviously, to be able to get a job in that kind of organization, you'd have to be able to speak English. Also, then as well for businesses to be able to deal with other internationally in English with other businesses. So there are lots of implications or lots of benefits to learning English and knowing English if you're an EFL learner. But particularly for ESOL learners, then, living in the UK or other English language speaking countries, the disadvantages of having a low level of English or not being able to speak English at all are really, really very rather significant. So a few years ago, actually now, there was a census in the UK. So this is a survey where the government sends out and everyone living in the UK has to complete this survey. So it was found that in England and Wales, over 1 million people, just over 1 million, identify themselves as not being able to speak English well or at all. Okay. Now, of this million, only 123,000 or thereabouts were actually in college or in any kind of provision. So this means there were over 900,000 learners who had a very low level of English who were not able to access or weren't accessing any English language provision, which is quite a staggering number. And considering all the points we've just looked at how not being able to speak English can really affect a person's well-being and the standard of living, this is really quite a significant number. Yeah. And also, it was found that over half of this group were women. So ESOL accessibility then is something that's really crucial if we're going to try to increase the outcomes for learners who have English as a second language so they have better opportunities. Yeah. Okay, so I know that lots of people here this evening are working in an ESOL environment, but it'd be interesting, again, to share some ideas about what you think could be a barrier to somebody learning English. And this could be in an ESOL context or in an EFL context. What would you say are the barriers to learning English? You don't have to give lots of different examples. 1 or 2 is fine. But if you could write that in the chat, please, that would be really interesting.
Gosh, nice, some interesting ideas coming
Yeah,
in here. Lots of C's: cost, culture, and confidence, commitments. Lots of C's:
yeah.
context. Goodness. Okay.
Motivation, yeah. Physical access, okay, yeah. Location. Might not be allowed to go out and learn. That's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Simon, what do you think? Have you experience of teaching ESOL? What would you say are the barriers in the UK for people
Gosh,
accessing?
yes, in my experience, I think a lot of them have been hit on the mark here with in the chat box, but I think sometimes it's cost or just availability. These courses aren't made available, or maybe they're not communicated in other community languages so people know they're available. I think those have been the 2 big things that I've noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, accessibility then, first of all, but actually being able to get on a course. So as we saw on the previous slide, only of the 1 million people, and this is just people who can speak, who say they can't speak English at all or very well. Of those million, only 100,000 or so are actually in any kind of language, accessing any kind of language provision. So this also means that people maybe who have a higher standard of English are also unable to access provision as well. So they might have enough to be able to work, but have they got enough to go on and get a better job? So the situation can be for a lot of migrants to the UK is that they're actually highly skilled and have qualifications and experiences in their own language, but when coming to the UK or an English speaking country, their level of English isn't enough to allow them then to pursue their career or continue in the same kind of field, and they're limited. And then obviously, implications of having to work, you just have to get on, you've got to find a job, you've got to earn money, and then people then become stuck. And that's again where accessibility comes in, because if you're working 9 to 5 or on shifts, or you're working at weekends, it's very difficult then to join an ESOL course that's from 9 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock in the afternoon, because you have to work or your shifts will change. Yeah, so certainly access to a suitable ESOL or EFL course is a real issue. Immigration status, certainly that makes a huge difference in the UK, what you're entitled to, what you're not entitled to, how long you have to have been in the country for, and that can make a big difference. And certainly as well, financial constraints. I think that's, as we mentioned, if you're working, that can be a constraint, can't it? You haven't got the time to study a course, or you can't afford to pay for the course. And in the UK as well, there are some sort of very strange rules around how much you're allowed to earn before then you're deemed to be earning too much, that you then have to pay for your own course, which then isn't affordable because you just don't have that extra money. And certainly in an EFL context, learning English abroad can be hugely expensive. Yeah.
And I think that's where we get a crossover sometimes in my own context, teaching EFL here in London. We get what we might consider ESOL students because the funding they've got gives them access to this, but it's few and far between, and it can really depend on where they're from. And as you say, whether or not they can afford to pay some money towards it, no money towards it. So it's quite a minefield, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think somebody as well in the chat mentioned access to technology. So this can also obviously limit somebody's ability to come to a class. Maybe if the only classes available perhaps might be online, and they haven't got the digital skills to join online, or they don't have a suitable internet connection. Yeah. ESOL accessibility in terms of technology can be quite challenging. So it can open up doors for lots of people, but also at the same time, it can prevent people from being able to join. Personal circumstances, and I think someone mentioned, family, perhaps culturally, people not being allowed to join. Certainly, I think if you have children or you're caring, you have caring responsibilities, that can be a massive barrier as well. Not being able to go somewhere and take your children is a big barrier. Limited community support, if you haven't got anywhere to go, there are no local community classes that you can join, or perhaps maybe people within your community not wanting you to go, that could be an issue as well. Employment status, as we mentioned before, certainly in England, if you're unemployed, you're entitled to certain classes. If you're employed, you're not, and that can be a big minefield. And health, are you able to get to a venue? Is there anything, are the venues accessible? And age as well. So, being of a certain age, maybe being shy, not knowing how to access anything, not knowing, how you might get to a class and so on. So all these factors, I mean, I'm sure there are lots more as well that people have mentioned. And access to native speakers. So that's an interesting one. So it could be, even if you're living in the UK, that you don't really have access to native speakers, especially, I suppose, if you're at home and you're living with your family and you're working, how easy is it to, if someone's tried to start talking to you in Tesco's and having a conversation, you'd probably think they're a bit odd. So it's quite difficult to actually get talking, isn't it, with people? It's hard to make conversation. It's hard to make friends.
Yes, okay. So this is not related to the teachers being native speakers. This is
No.
more, how they can use English outside the ESOL classroom. Once they've left the classroom, where do they
Mm.
actually get to use their English? Because the home language is it going to be or are going to be different to English, presumably.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And location as well. That's an interesting one that we haven't got on here. But if you're living, in maybe perhaps in a more rural area, whether that's in the UK or abroad, what classes could you actually join? So that's a really interesting point as well. And perhaps you haven't got the money to travel to that class. So that's also another barrier. So there are lots of different barriers. So we're going to try then and think of ways of overcoming those barriers, which is what we're here to talk about today. And just, if I'm sure you're aware, or maybe you might not be aware if you're not based in the UK, but we have an organization called NATECLA, and they have put together a strategy for making ESOL, creating ESOL more, a vision for ESOL provision in the UK. And they've put this to the government, although nothing as yet has particularly happened. But there's a real recognition that people need English language provision. As soon as they arrive in the UK, and this would be the same in any other English language speaking, English as a first language speaking country. If you're not able to access, if you haven't got access to English language provision, that's going to stop you from then perhaps finding a job, from integrating, from feeling part of a community. And that's really, really important. So let's move on then to the main part of the webinar, which is really about how we can, as teachers, as volunteers, as course providers, how we can then make access to ESOL easier for our students, and what we can do to increase the provision, and what we can do to increase opportunities for learners to improve their English in all sorts of different contexts. So I'm going to take you through 8 strategies that we've used, and then please do, comment or join in, Simon, if you want to ask me any questions. Okay, so strategy number 1 then that we've used is to try and build partnerships with local charities and local community organizations. Now, why is this beneficial? Well, as we mentioned before, that some barriers to learning can be that classes are not in an accessible area, learners aren't able to travel to a venue, or maybe they're not able to go to college for certain reasons because it's too far, or the times don't suit, or they're working. So by building a partnership with a local organization, that the learners in that area will be familiar with the venue. Often there are fewer restrictions. So as you can see here in this picture, we've got a group of mums that were coming along to a class and bringing children, which would never happen in a college for all sorts of different reasons. You can often use these rooms completely free of charge because it's in a community setting, or at a really discounted price. And then also, you can link to other organizations. The organization will often have other things going on in the center. So they might come in for an English class, but might end up joining a sewing class, or some kind of health workshop, or just making friends with other, users in that center. The way that we started up, actually, when we started delivering the TESOL, was that we put in our application, and we had our validation, but we needed a venue. We needed somewhere that we could actually teach and deliver, or for our trainees to be able to practice, their skills and complete their teaching practices. So we were working with a few organizations running the Talk English project. And then I made contact with Caritas, with an organization there called Cornerstone, and they were running lots of English classes in Manchester. Well, actually, they weren't running classes. They just had a couple of drop-in sessions with volunteers, and suddenly the numbers kept increasing and increasing. So we partnered up, and we then took over the English language provision. We arranged separate classes at different levels, and then we used some of those classes as teaching practice classes. So that helped us in terms of being able to provide teaching practice for our trainees, but then also for the centre, they had classes that were being delivered by qualified English language teachers at different levels at different times. And then lots of our teachers who came onto the course then went on to volunteer and work in the centre and so on. So it's a great way of making those links, and then, you know, and building, setting something up that then can continue to grow as well. Because that's the key, isn't it, about accessibility? You know, if there's funding out there, the funding, once the funding's gone, it's gone. So it's how can we keep things, how can we sort of create a bit of a legacy and keep things going?
I
So,
really love that
sorry.
idea. I just have to say, just the whole idea
Yeah.
of building up, you know, and making those connections between EFL and ESOL in countries where English is spoken as the first language, but also just to go back to your idea of having the mums there, or the au pairs or the nannies or whatever with the children. I think that's a really nice accessible idea, which again bleeds over into certain EFL settings. You know, I can imagine that, you know, there is a market there where it could be supportive in EFL settings to have mums coming along learning English. So I think that's great.
Yeah, exactly. Or, you know, mums, or bringing along other friends, or, you know, relatives, people that maybe you would feel more comfortable with. And it's that first step, isn't it? You know, your first step into learning or into accessing a course. Okay, and then the second strategy is reaching out to local businesses. So again, you know, we're in Manchester, so there are lots of businesses around, but this could work in I suppose in any country actually. Lots of organizations, especially larger organizations, will have a budget for maybe volunteering for their staff, or to try and you know, make connections with the local communities, find out what their needs are, and so on. So Ricardo is actually a national organization. It's an environmental consulting agency, and a few years back, a trainee who obviously successfully completed the TESOL course went on to work with Ricardo, and they got in contact, and wanted to try and set up some volunteer opportunities for employees. And so this was a great opportunity for them to come along, and I was delighted, because it meant that we could have some really interesting workshops on the environment. So a couple of trainees, a couple of employees have come along so far and have done some really excellent sessions on saving money, you know, how to save money with the heating and so on, and strategies for keeping your house warm, which was really, really useful. Lots of vocabulary, you know, what do you call the thing that you put in front of the door to keep the wind out? A draft excluder. So when would you ever teach draft excluder in an EFL or ESOL class? Doesn't usually come up. So all this it was great for vocabulary, and we also talked about recycling. So I'm sure if you are in the UK, and I'm sure maybe it's the same in where you might be across the you know, internationally, but in England particularly, in every council we have about 1 million bins. We have different bins for different things, so it can be very confusing actually, because you have a pink bin for certain things, a black bin for paper, a brown bin for garden waste. And so one of the employees came in and gave a great talk and brought in bits of rubbish, and we were all sorting rubbish, and it was a really fantastic opportunity for the learners to speak to professionals in a context where they would probably would never meet actually. So that was really interesting.
I love that, because you're kind of moving into task-based learning, or even a sort of CLIL. You know, you're learning something through the medium of English. I guess it's even EMI, English as a medium of instruction, which is fantastic, and it's all part of building up that community of practice as well. I love this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it was really interesting for the students, and we've had a similar we did a similar activity actually a few years ago in the Yemeni Association, where we had a group of accountants coming, and they just came for a couple of hours and they just had a chat with the learners. They just came to one group, and it was pretty much one-to-one. And it was a really lovely opportunity for people to have a chat together, and share those experiences, and just talk about anything really. But again, it's creating those opportunities for people to to meet and to chat. And also, will these workshops were sort of practical workshops, but they can offer more skilled CV writing and so on, and also opportunities for perhaps learners who are looking to go into that kind of field. Perhaps this is particular to environmental planning and so on, but having access to those kind of work opportunities, it's really sort of invaluable, really, to have that expertise and people coming, and it's great for the organizations too, because then they can give something for their employees to do, as well as their sort of day-to-day work. It's something that's enriching to them and gives them a good chance to sort of boost their brand as well, in a way, I suppose. But it was a great success. And this was another gentleman who came in. He was talking about saving energy, and we have a pledge here from one of our learners, which was to keep the thermostat to 18 degrees in the winter to try and save a little bit of money. Whether they stuck to that last week, I don't know, because it was particularly chilly.
I was going to say that's a challenge in the UK at certain times of the year, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, then another strategy, or something that we've certainly made use of, and this is particular to people living in the UK, or organisations in the UK and Ireland, is the Trinity Access Fund. So we applied for the fund. The process is super easy, very quick, and with the fund, we were able to extend provision for a group of pre-entry learners for a couple of months after the government provision had finished. We were able to pay for those learners to then take speaking and listening exams, the STEP exams. As we mentioned before, a lot of learners at this level tend to be women who have, not always, but perhaps haven't studied in their own countries, have never taken any kind of formal exam, or have received any kind of formal certificate. So it was a huge boost for those learners to be able to take those exams and come out and have a certificate. And it can be used for other purposes as well, such as travel and equipment and so on. But they're also, one thing to keep an eye out on are live grants. So this is Salford CVS, which is a volunteer organization. But if you Google, just put a Google search like grants, ESOL grants, there are lots of small pots of money that you can access, and which will be enough to provide, to pay for a teacher, to pay for a venue. But again, if you've made those connections with community organizations, costs can be kept really rather low, because you just, as long as you've paid for your tutor, you've got a location that's accessible, and you've partnered with a charity perhaps, and then there are a lot more opportunities for funding if you partner with a charity or a community group to bid for money, to bid for funding to provide English classes. So it doesn't always have to be something that's happening in a college, or through government funding. There are ways around it, but the only way that you can find these ways is to sort of make contact with these organizations. And often you just have to go in. So, with organizations in Manchester, it's just been us going into those places and saying, we'd like to come and run some English classes, or people maybe even contacting us and saying or just through word of mouth, or through different teachers that we know, there's this organization that have suddenly lots of learners who want to learn English. Is there something that you can do about that? So yeah, making those kind of connections is great, but certainly this is something, if you're in the UK and in Ireland, that you should look into. Then obviously when you have your learners, one expense is materials. What can you use to teach? Obviously in an EFL setting, often learners will have a textbook. I don't know if that's the case where you're working now, Simon. So part of their course fee will cover materials, so they'll all have a book. So a teacher can just go into the class and use that book, and obviously supplement if they want to. But in an ESOL environment, or in an ESOL classroom, resources are often very, very limited. So what can we do to, where can we find material that's suitable that we can use? So here are just a few ideas. And well, they're about 20 years old now, but in 2001, the government put together a Skills for Life package with lots of materials at all the different levels. So from entry one, which is A1 or beginner level, to level 2, which is like a C1, almost C2 level. And you can, at each of those levels, you have 10 different units generally, usually functional based. So based on, community, sport, healthy eating, and so on. But you have teachers' books, you'll have the notes, you have audio, and you have all the worksheets all in a package that can be downloaded for free. So again, this link will be at the end of the webinar. I've put a list together of useful links that you can find all these resources, which I'll happily share. But you just have to simply click on, you can create an account and you can have access to all this material, which is useful not just in the UK, also abroad as well. Often a lot of the speakers in the audio, you'll find they have different regional accents from the UK, which is really interesting actually. And the topics are a little bit more yeah, I suppose they're more ESOL focused. I don't know if you've ever used these materials, Simon.
Yeah, I think they are very useful for EFL things. I've certainly used them both in the UK and abroad as well. Because as you say, as we do normally with lessons, you might find a nice text here that you can
Yeah.
slightly adapt if you need to, if it's not for people that are moving to the UK. But yeah, they're really good. And as you say, there's a nice variety of accents and different types of texts available. So yeah, they're really nice.
Yeah. And actually, following on from what you just said there, I'll come back to Trinity again. I'm mentioning Trinity again, but there are other sites. So the Oxford University Press, I mean, there are other publishers that you can look at, but they have lots of material that is available for free that you can access. Everything really, apart from the student's book. But you mentioned about reading texts. So they have dyslexia-friendly reading texts at all the different levels, so up to advanced. So, if you're a budding teacher, and we spend our lives, creating material and looking for texts that are appropriate. Well, there are lots of texts that you can use here that are for free. They're freely available, and you can print them off without, having to have lots of different colors in the backgrounds, which often, with a textbook, you'll have lots of images and the text will be small and so on. These are created so that you can download them. They can be used as a fantastic resource. And you can see you can download all the audio, you can download vocabulary games. So these are really useful to point learners in the direction of this site, so they can practice the grammar activities on their own. You can incorporate them into your classes, you can send them links, to the audio. You can then write your own listening task or create your own reading task and so on. And then back to exam boards and the websites, for example. This is just the Trinity website. So obviously Trinity, we have all the international exams, but also all the ESOL exams. And for all of those exams, you'll find activities that you can use to practice and prepare learners for those exams. You've got really useful videos of learners taking exams. So much that you can actually use and make use of in the classroom, if you don't have lots of resources that you can give to your learners.
Sometimes they're just a really nice springboard, something that you can sort of start off in the class and you might be able to create a lesson around that, or it becomes your lesson in some ways. So yeah, it's really nice to have access to these things because, as you say, in certain times, finding the material suitable for a class, especially if it's maybe a bit mixed level or they have quite special wants or needs, it's really nice to have a couple of places to go, your to-go places, if you like, where you can get at least an idea of what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can make use of what's available for free in your local area. So in Manchester, we're very lucky, and I'm sure in London, there are lots of places to visit and go. But even if you were living perhaps in a more rural area or in another country, there are lots of opportunities outside the classroom. So, for example, here we've got some images of uh, visiting local libraries. That's a great, if there if you have a local library in your area, taking the learners there, showing them, now we have these sort of fancy sort of systems of scanning books in and out. You don't have to, because you don't have to talk to anyone anymore, which so in one way, there are fewer chances to speak to anyone in the library because there aren't actually any workers there. But you knowing how to scan those books and how to get to use the resources that are available there. Simply walking around, where you might be in a city, you might be, in the countryside, but there's so much vocabulary and so much can come from a walk and taking a look at specific places that you might want to show. So Manchester, we've got all sorts of history. We've got statues of Abraham Lincoln, Emmeline Pankhurst there. There's so much that you could share with learners, and then hopefully, in terms of making people feel more at home in their community, then they think, there might be a building that they would never think about going in. So lots of the museums, you would imagine that there'd be a fee to go in, but actually the majority of museums are free. So it's a nice place to go in and have a look around, and maybe take family, take friends, take children, or even, on your own to explore. In Salford, we have it's like a museum. It's called Ordsall Hall, which is apparently where the gunpowder plot was first hatched. Now, I know there's probably lots of places that say that this was the first place that they started talking about the gunpowder plot. But this is a fantastic museum. And you can take learners there for free on a tour. They can look around. And often with museums, they'll have an ESOL department or an ESOL worker who's there specifically to take learners around, and they'll have worksheets and so on. Or you can have a guided tour yourself as a teacher. You can download all the guides and just take them around on your own. So there are lots of different opportunities. And if perhaps you were living in a rural area, lots of museums will have virtual tours as well that you could take learners on.
Yes, I was going to say, and those can sometimes be really great, again, for those of us not based in the UK. Those can be really good resources for EFL classes as well, to take them around. You're going around number 10 Downing Street or the White House or any kind of museum as well. They're really nice resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And it opens up sort of a different type of language as well, doesn't it? Lots of opportunities to maybe use vocabulary that you wouldn't necessarily use, that wouldn't come up in a course book, or it just sort of widens everyone's experience. And I think just getting out as well makes you feel better anyway, doesn't it? Just physically doing something, going somewhere, meeting other people. It gives you a sense that you've achieved something in that day, and you've found out something you didn't realize about, and that gives everyone then more of a sense of belonging. And certainly in Manchester, it's a huge city, and all sorts of lots of different cultures and lots of different cultural events. So just finding out what events are coming up. Are there any processions or I don't know, meetings in parks or things that you can sort of tap into for free? There are always lots of things going on. It might be a cake sale or a coffee morning somewhere, and you just might take your learners along to that coffee morning, and they can have a cup of tea and a cake and chat with people and so on. So it's just being aware of what's coming up, what kind of events are happening. And we're very lucky as well to live near the BBC. The BBC studios are now in Salford, and one of my tutors always arranges for her learners to go on a trip to listen to the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra practicing, and you can go in and you can listen, and they have all sorts of events like this that you would never know about. People don't realize that they can actually just apply, put the name into a list, and then they'll get a ticket and they can go along and they can listen to these kind of performances. And again, so it's opening up sort of experiences that people might not have, or they might not hear about or know about. Okay, this is a really important one. And this is something that, again, not just in an ESOL context, but in an EFL context, our learners have so much to give, past experiences. It's great that if they can share their skills. So putting on some sessions where like a bit of a show and tell, I suppose. So we were lucky enough to have one learner who for 30 years worked as a trainer for St. John's Ambulance in Hong Kong. And they gave some sessions on safety in the home, how to keep safe, what to do if someone burns themselves, and here we can you can see it all in action, someone having a heart attack, how to stop someone bleeding, what to do if someone's choking. And then here, one of the learners was completing some art, some henna painting. So these are, again, different opportunities for learners to share their skills, to find out some really useful information, vocabulary, again, that might not come up in, your average EFL course book. Practical information that's going to actually help in an ESOL context in a day-to-day situation, to what to say, when you're calling 999, what do you say, what's happening? Oh, someone's choking. It's really useful and really engaging stuff. And again, it's great for the learners because they're getting that experience. They can put down, if they're looking for jobs, they can put on a CV that they've delivered some sessions, and then perhaps maybe then go on to train those volunteers to deliver other sessions. So again, it's keeping or having more opportunities to increase provision. So it doesn't just have to be with an ESOL teacher. It can be, volunteers that are trained who then could then go on and train themselves, and set up smaller conversation classes. So it's that taking those first steps in that volunteer training volunteers, giving them the materials and the resources, maybe providing a space which you have through all your connections that you've made with your local community partners and so on. And then that's really helping to make ESOL accessible then, because it's just empowering people to help others, which I think just has a roll on sort of beneficial effect for everybody, really.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love this idea. It's just completely learner centered as well, which we're always trying to do in our EFL and ESL classes, I guess, making it about the learners. And you couldn't get more learner centered than having a learner present their skills and really feel, very useful, again,
Yeah.
Especially as you pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, in periods where they might feel a bit frustrated that they're not able to use all of their skills and knowledge to the best effect. So I really like this idea.
Yeah. Okay, then exploit, but not in a bad way. Exploit your teachers or teacher training opportunities. So this is, I suppose, specific if you are a training provider, how you can increase ESOL accessibility by firstly creating those teaching practice classes that are free for learners to come along, and obviously, because it's on a TESOL course, they'll generally tend to be well planned. They're following a scheme of work and so on. So this creates lots of extra opportunities for learners, and then offering sort of mentoring and volunteering opportunities for newly qualified teachers, which is great for those teachers because they can get some experience under their belts before applying for jobs, or when they go to apply, they can say that they've had so many hours of teaching experience. So it just enables more to be done, and trainees get more confidence, learners have more opportunities to practice. Again, partnering up as we did with local organizations to run teaching practice classes in venues, perhaps taking on students who are studying for the PGDE, which is like a teacher training qualification in the UK, but I'm sure they're probably similar qualifications internationally as well. And teachers always need to have a placement, they need to have a mentor. So offering those services, contacting local education institutions, universities, telling them that this is what you do. Do you have any trainees that wish to come and speak, to train with us and so on? Yeah. And then finally, I'm conscious of the time, sorry, I'm getting carried away, is how to extend learning outside the classroom. So this is obviously true for EFL as well, but in ESOL, we want to help our learners to improve and maximize their learning outside the classroom. And one thing I think that's probably quite difficult, or previously was difficult, especially for lower level learners, is you might have an English class and you'll go to the class and you'll have your list of vocabulary, or you'll take your book home. But if you can't read, and you have no idea what this word says, how do you know how to say it? So almost it's gone, and then you might not have another class again for another week. So the old kind of worksheets don't really work anymore. But thankfully now these days we have something which I'm sure there are other tools available, but this is something that I know that I use a lot, and my tutors use all the time, is something called Word Wall. I don't know if you've come across that, Simon.
I know some colleagues that have used it, but tell
Yeah.
us more about that.
It's amazing. This is another webinar in itself, actually, and I'm not being paid by Wordwall to promote their services, but it's actually very cheap. But it's a fantastic tool that allows you to create um, all sorts of different language games and activities, and the beauty of them is they can be shared very easily in WhatsApp groups or in chats in Google Classrooms by email and so on. So here's something I prepared earlier. I won't actually show you how to make a word wall because it's not actually very complicated, but because time is running out, just to have a look at some things that I have made. So these are a couple of activities. Again, we can share the links. You can have a look and see how to make them. And if you go to WordWall, you can just find this and you can edit this and keep it for yourself and change it. But this was just an activity that we created to help learners with the vocabulary for the recycling lesson that we did. So it was naming different types of rubbish, which again is not a normal topic in an EFL or ESOL sort of course book. So it's knowing what types of rubbish there are and what you should do with them. So firstly, you could and the beauty of Wordwall is you can type a word in, you can type in batteries, and it will come up with 100 different pictures of batteries, and you just choose which one you like the most. And it's super quick, and you can add audio. It allows you to just type batteries into a chat, and you can choose the voice. You can be a male voice, a female voice. You can have a different accent. It can be from New Zealand, from Ireland. So learners then can hear the word, they can see the word, and they can practice it again and again and again and again. So fantastic for lower levels, but also you can adapt it and use it for high levels as well. So we would create these kind of word walls, and then making use of WhatsApp. Again, it depends on your institution and your rules about safeguarding and sharing numbers and so on. But if all the learners agree, you can create WhatsApp groups for your learners, and it's very quick then to share links to videos or word walls, photographs, PowerPoints. So learners can go away and review what they've learned and practice, and maybe ask some questions, chat with each other. Also creating a Google Classroom, again, free, it doesn't cost anything. It's great for teachers, and we have our own Google Classroom where all the teachers upload their slides, so we're not recreating the wheel every time that we teach a certain point. So a great resource for teachers and for students as well. So you can have we have a Google Classroom for learners as well, that they can go on and they can practice lots of different language. So yeah, these tools are free. Even with WordWall, you can create a free account. So these are the strategies, and they've worked. They're working well, and things are always changing all the time. But I think that's the key. It's making those connections will enable providers and teachers then to make ESOL more accessible.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all those. If anyone has any particular questions, please do use the Q&A or the chat box. But in the meantime, I just want to say that lots of those stand out. And as you said right at the very beginning here, I think there is that connection between the ESOL world and the EFL world with lots of these. The idea of making it student-centered and about the students themselves and adapting these ideas. I really loved bringing the real world into the classroom, but also, interestingly, the option that we get when we're working with ESOL in a place where English is being spoken as the first language, we get to take the students into the real world as well. So I really like that idea of, yes, bringing it in, but also taking students out, not just for social program things, although that's part of it, but helping them experience the city or the area they're in a lot more. I love that idea. And of course, one of the things I love more than ever is lots of the things you've provided with us today are are free to use, which is always
Yeah.
useful for us as teachers and as academic managers and so on. So yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Really informative, as people are saying in the chat box now.
Fantastic. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got the so here's just a list of that I've put together. Perhaps we can share this, I'm sure. So you've got some interesting reading if you wanted to read a bit more about the English effect, which is the document that I referred to at the beginning from the British Council, which talked about English and where it's spoken and so on, and the importance of English and so on. Also, the strategy for ESOL in the UK. This is a really great document, and it gives lots of figures and facts as well. It's so great if you're trying to write a bid and you need to have some evidence, of why it's important. Why is it important? And I think that the good news is that there is an awareness that it is important to ESOL is important, and being able to speak English is important, and making ESOL accessible is vital. So the RSMP are being funded by the community Department of Communities and in the government community and excuse me, the government department to actually pay for suitable candidates to complete teacher training courses so that they can then provide ESOL in these kind of community settings. So there is an awareness there that there's a need for more ESOL provision, so which is a good thing. But hopefully then there'll be more in terms of funding and in terms of projects like Talk English, which were great and which turned into the English for Integration Fund, but then which then sadly just end. And we're waiting, we're waiting for more funding. But in the meantime, what can we do to try and increase those opportunities? We can't, if we're waiting for the government to suddenly fund projects that they might never do that, or it could be another 5 years. So in the meantime, what can we do to help our local residents, our colleagues, our friends, and so on, to increase and improve their English? And hopefully today I've you've picked up some ideas of how you might do that in whichever context you're working in.
Definitely, definitely. We've got quite a good question here. Someone's asked about getting the funding that you've mentioned before, and obviously you've done that as an organization. Now we know that some people that work in ESOL, they tend to work more alone sometimes. They might be working for an organization, but kind of individually. They might not have a staff room that they're regularly going to, etc. So in terms of applying for funding, do you know, in your experience, does that have to be done through a company or through a school, or can individual teachers also apply for this kind of funding?
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because it depends on your status as a business. So if you're a limited company, then there are fewer things that you can apply for, because obviously organizational or funds usually want it to be a community interest or a charity. So which is why it's a good idea to partner up with a local organization. So we've done that with the Yemeni Centre, for example, in Manchester. They've written a bid, and then we're providing the ESOL classes for them. So it would depend. If you look on, so for example, the Salford CVS, or if you Google, usually when they have the information about a bid, it will have who can apply, and it will say it must be a community organization or a small business. If you're an individual teacher, I think it's still possible, but I think usually it has to be an organization, because there has to be sort of governance there. They have to know where the money's going, so it's you're not just going off on holiday to Acapulco or something with the grant. So I suppose that's why, but that's why it's good to partner up with another organization. But there are pots of money out there. Yeah, I'll go back to. I can share the
Always
link
good to know they're
actually.
out there. More
Yeah,
difficult to try and find how to get your hands on
absolutely.
them.
Yeah, that's it. It's knowing, and it's and even if you look on if you're living in the UK, I'm just using it as an example, but your local councils will have chests and funds that you can get yourself on their mailing list. So whenever there's opportunities for funding come up, you'll be notified, and then you can see what you can apply for. So they're good places to look. Local councils, local volunteer organizations usually have lots of information about that. Maybe even local libraries actually will find local charities. But just Google. ESOL grants or language learning grants in your particular area. Large charities, like the National Lottery, you can look into applying to them. And smaller local organizations as well will often have pots of money.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's kind of it's down to us a little bit to dig into those things and look for the national or
Yeah,
local or even sort of charities that are in our areas as well. But
yeah,
yeah, hopefully, well, you can also see, I hope, in the chat box that lots of people have said they have no more questions because you were so thorough in your presentation. So
fantastic.
as we hit the hour here, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for sharing your experience and your ideas. They've been really useful in all settings, I think. I know I'm certainly going back to my school tomorrow with a few things to discuss with my Director of Studies. So thank you very much for your time today. And thank you everyone for attending as well. That wraps up Transformative Teachers webinar series for 2023. But fear not, we will be back in 2024. We will soon have all of the upcoming webinars, or the next couple of upcoming webinars, on the usual website. So keep your eyes out for those. And we look forward to seeing you next year. Happy festive periods to everyone, and Happy New Year, I guess, already. Thank you
Yes,
very much.
Merry Christmas. That's fantastic. I feel like I should make a word wall about for Christmas now and share it with you all. Yeah. Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your days, everyone. Thank you for joining.